The first thing she noticed was the smell, not the body, not the cold stone beneath her cheek, or the straw poking through the thin wool of a dress that was not hers, or the distant sound of someone weeping 2 rooms over. The smell hit first, damp and iron-tinged and organic in the way that things rotting slowly in dark places tend to be, and it was so aggressively, specifically medieval, that Layla lay still for a full 30 seconds, simply processing it. In 2150, even the poorest sectors of the Eastern Reclamation Zone smelled like recycled air and industrial solvent. Clean in the way that nothing living could be clean. Sterile, she had grown up breathing air that had passed through 7 filtration stages before it reached human lungs, air that had no memory of earth or animal or rain, and she had never once thought to miss the alternative. She missed it now, in the abstract way you miss a limb after it's been gone long enough that the phantom ache becomes simply part of you. She opened her eyes. Stone ceiling, cracked in 3 places, with a thin line of gray morning filtering through a gap near the far wall where the mortar had given up entirely. A single tallow candle, burned to its last half-inch, guttered on a ledge above a wooden table that held a clay cup, a heel of dark bread, and a folded piece of cloth that might have been a handkerchief or a bandage, or someone's best attempt at both. A straw pallet beneath her, a wool blanket that smelled of other people. She sat up slowly, and the body moved with her. That was the strange part. Not terrible, not painful. Just other. Like wearing a coat you hadn't broken in yet, still stiff at the shoulders, still carrying the shape of the person who'd owned it before. She looked down, her breath hitching as her gaze traveled over a form that was softer, more curved than the wiry, functional frame she had inhabited for 24 years. The hands in her lap were not her hands. Daintier knuckles. A small scar across the base of the right thumb, crescent-shaped, old. The nails were bitten down to nothing. She turned them over and back again, her skin brushing against the rough wool of her skirts. The sensation was electric. A sudden, jarring reminder of how starved for real, tactile input her previous life had been. Blonde hair fell across her vision when she tilted her head. She pushed it back, her fingers lingering against the warmth of her own neck. The pulse there was steady, a rhythmic thrum that felt impossibly vibrant. Right? She thought. That part. She had been reading the novel for 3 weeks before the world ended, which in practical terms meant 3 weeks before the last filtration plant in her sector failed, and the air outside the compound became unbreathable without a mask. And they had run out of masks, and the compound council had made a decision that Layla had refused to be present for, because she had known, with the particular exhausted clarity of someone who has been surviving things for long enough, exactly what that decision would be. She had been in the corner of her bunk with her tablet, reading a Transmigration romance novel she'd downloaded off a pirated archive, because in the last days of everything you are allowed to read whatever you want without justification. The novel was called The Crown and the Coldlands, and it was, objectively, absurd. A fantasy medieval kingdom called Elfidria, a good prince and a bad prince, a scheming court, a heroine who was a minor noblewoman with inexplicable combat skills, and a talent for making powerful men fall in love with her through the specific alchemy of being beautiful and having a tragic backstory. The villain was Prince Lucien Aquintaine, the king's eldest son, bastard born to a former mistress, who believed his age and his obvious tactical superiority entitled him to a throne that had been legally designated to his younger half-brother since birth. He was brilliant and terrible, and lost, predictably, in the final confrontation with his brother Edward, in the throne room of the palace. The author described it in satisfying detail. Lucien had been beaten, imprisoned, and was in the process of being tried for treason when the novel ended, presumably to be followed by a sequel that Layla had not been able to find on the archive. She had fallen asleep reading. She had woken up here, in the body of a girl who was not in the novel. A background figure, unnamed, probably. The kind of NPC that existed to populate a world, the daughter of a petty criminal, living in whatever constitutes slums in a fantasy kingdom, present only to make the real characters feel real by contrast. Layla sat with this for a moment. Her hand strayed to the laces of her bodice, testing the unfamiliar weight of the fabric against her chest. Every movement felt deliberate, a slow awakening of senses that had been dulled by the sterile gray of the reclamation zone. Then she got up, because sitting with things had never gotten her very far, and found the clay cup held water, and drank it, and located a second, slightly less stale piece of bread in a cloth pouch hanging from a nail by the door, and ate that too. She was starving in the specific way that suggested the body she was in had not been eating well for some time. She ate without haste and looked around the room and took inventory in the way she had been trained to take inventory. Resources, threats, exits, unknowns. Resources, minimal. Bread. Water. Blanket. The clothes on her back, a gray dress, worn thin at the elbows, roughly mended at the hem. A leather belt with a small knife in a sheath so dull it was more decorative than functional. A pair of boots that almost fit. Threats. Unclear. The weeping from 2 rooms over had stopped. She could hear now the particular ambient noise of a building with many occupants, coughing, voices, the clatter of something metal being moved across stone, and underneath it all, further away, what sounded like a city. Street noise, carts, animals, exits, 1 door, unbolted, 1 window, small, with wooden shutters. Unknowns, approximately everything else. She went to the window and cracked the shutter. Morning light fell across her face, pale, cold, the kind of early spring sun that looks warmer than it is, and below her was a narrow street packed with the visual noise of medieval life. Stalls being set up, a man dragging a cart of something covered in canvas, children in clothes so oversized they were wading through fabric rather than wearing it. A dog of indeterminate ancestry eating something in the gutter with enormous concentration. Elthidria, the capital, based on the description in the novel. She could see the palace walls from here if she craned. A dark stone bulk several streets over, flags flying in the thin morning wind. She stood there for a while, looking at it. She had been in worse situations than this. She had been in situations where the air itself was trying to kill her, where water was a thing you negotiated for, where the difference between sleeping and dying was 2 degrees of temperature. A medieval fantasy kingdom with at least some level of social infrastructure was not, objectively, her worst landing. She had food. She had shelter. She had a body that appeared to be functional and young and in reasonable health, given its obvious lack of nutrition. She had knowledge from a world 150 years ahead of this one. That was something. That was possibly a great deal. She closed the shutter. The door opened before she reached it, and a woman backed through it carrying a wooden bucket and talking over her shoulder at someone in the corridor. She was perhaps 45, with the look of someone who had been pretty once and was now made of something harder and less yielding. Strong forearms, a sharp economy of movement, dark circles under eyes that catalogued Layla with a single practice sweep the moment she turned around. "You're up," the woman said. It was not a greeting. It was a notation. "Yes," Layla said. The woman set the bucket down, pulled a rag from her belt, and began wiping the table with the focused energy of someone who cleaned things, not because they enjoyed it, but because mess was one of the many enemies she had decided to fight on principle. "Slept half the morning. I need water from the well before the queue gets long, and you're the one with the young legs." "All right," Layla said. The woman paused. Looked at her again, more carefully this time. Something in the look asked a question that the mouth didn't voice. A brief, almost imperceptible recalibration, the kind that happened when a person behaved unexpectedly. Whatever the original girl had usually said to this opening, it was apparently not all right. "Your father sent word," the woman said, returning to the table. "He wants bread." Layla waited. "We've got half a loaf. You'll take it to him this afternoon." She wrung the rag out into the bucket with unnecessary force. "Tell him it's the last until the end of the week, and if he's been gambling again, I'll leave him there to rot." There was a violence in the way she said it that suggested she had been saying some version of this sentence for years. The kind of sentence that had worn grooves into a person. "Where is he?" Layla asked, though she was already beginning to understand. The woman gave her a look that contained about 15 years of exhaustion, compressed into a single expression. "Where he always is, girl. Where he's been 3 times in the last 2 years. She jerked her chin in the general direction of the palace walls, the prison cells beneath the east wing. "Drunk and disorderly, this time. At least it wasn't theft. At least it's not hanging." She said that last part quietly, as if it were a prayer she'd gotten tired of meaning, but couldn't stop saying. Layla filed it away. The woman was her mother, this body's mother, and the man in the prison was this body's father, and she was being asked to carry bread through the cells of a royal prison to a petty criminal who had spent most of his daughter's life being a burden to the women who loved him. This was, she understood, the ordinary texture of this girl's life, the backdrop against which everything else occurred. She thought about the novel. Thought about the timeline. If she had landed in the right place, Prince Lucien Aquintaine was somewhere in those cells right now, chained and beaten, and in the early days of a treason imprisonment that would eventually, 3 months from now, when the queen gave birth, be commuted to exile. She hadn't planned to go looking, but she was going to the prison anyway. The morning passed in a series of small physical negotiations between Layla and a body that was not quite hers. The legs knew the way to the well, she let them lead. The hands knew how to work the rope and the pulley, she let them work. She carried the bucket back through streets that were narrow and layered and intensely, overwhelmingly alive. The smell of bread from somewhere, and animal dung and wood smoke, and something frying in fat that made her stomach make a sound that was almost embarrassing. People moved around her with the focused urgency of people who had things to accomplish before the day turned, and the work didn't get easier. She watched them, all of it. The way the fishmonger at the corner spoke to his apprentice with a particular tilt of the head that meant move faster. The way 2 women passed each other without speaking, but with a look between them that carried an entire conversation about someone who wasn't present. The way a child of about 7 sat on a step and braided a piece of rope with total absorption, as if rope braiding were the only serious project in the world. Observation had been her primary survival skill for long enough that she did it automatically, the way other people breathed. You watched. You catalogued. You built your model of a place carefully, and you did not act on assumptions until the model was solid enough to bear weight. By the time she returned to the room, she had a working understanding of the street layout for 6 blocks, the approximate social hierarchy of the tenement building she was living in, based on who had nodded at her and who had not, and the name of the neighborhood, which she'd gathered from a shouted argument between 2 men at the end of the alley. Her mother was gone. A note on the table. She could read it, which meant the original girl had been literate. A small, useful grace said the bread was wrapped in cloth by the door, and she was to go before midday, or her father would think they weren't coming. Layla wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, picked up the bread, and went. The prison entrance was not impressive. That was perhaps the point. A door set into the palace's eastern outer wall, guarded by 2 soldiers who looked chronically bored, wearing the blue and gray of the Althydrian Royal Guard. A queue of perhaps a dozen people, family members she assumed, of the various individuals being held inside, waited with the particular patient resignation of people who had been doing this long enough that waiting had stopped feeling like an event and had become simply a condition of their lives. She joined the queue and waited. Observed. The guard on the left was younger, maybe 20, with the kind of face that hadn't settled into itself yet, and kept making small, eager movements that the rest of him was trying to suppress. He wanted to seem seasoned. He wasn't. The guard on the right was older, 40 at least, with the face of someone who had made peace with the fact that this was what his life had become, and was putting no more energy into the matter than was strictly required. When she reached the front, the older guard looked at the bread, looked at her, and said, "Name, Layla. Here for my father. Edric." He ran a finger down a list. Found it, made a mark. Cell row 4. Don't dawdle. She went in. The transition from outside to inside was an act of sense erasure. The noise and light of the street fell away, and what replaced it was a profound institutional quiet undercut by sounds that were not quite silence. Dripping water. A cough from somewhere deep. The distant, rhythmic clank of someone testing the limits of a chain with the mechanical persistence of a person who had run out of other things to do with their time. The air was cold and uniformly damp, the kind of cold that had been there for so long it had stopped being weather and had become architecture. She walked. The cells were behind iron bars set into stone alcoves, each one illuminated, barely, by a torch mounted at intervals along the corridor, spaced far enough apart that between them lay pools of genuine dark. The people inside them existed in varying states of degradation. Some sat upright against the walls with the careful dignity of those who had decided to make something of themselves under difficult circumstances. Some lay on their pocks with their backs to the bars and their faces to the wall. A few stood at the bars and watched her pass with the flat, evaluating attention of people whose days contained very little new information. She found her father in cell row 4. He was smaller than she expected. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. This body's memory carried only impressions, not images, and the impressions were largely emotional rather than visual. But she had somehow anticipated someone larger, the way forces that shape a life often seem physically larger when you finally see them. Edric was perhaps 50, wiry, with a narrow face and quick eyes that reminded her briefly and uncomfortably of her own. He sat on his pallet with a heel of old bread already in his hand, and looked up at her arrival with an expression that moved through guilt and relief and self-justification so rapidly they almost blurred together. "You came," he said. "Mother sent bread." She passed it through the bars. He took it with both hands and held it for a moment without eating it, which surprised her. Then he looked up. Something in her face made him pause. "You look different," he said. "I'm tired," she said, because it was true, and it was useful, and it was the kind of thing people accepted without investigating. He grunted. Looked at the bread. Looked at her. "Your mother's angry." "Yes." "She say anything?" "She said if you've been gambling again, she'll leave you there." He had the grace, at least, to look ashamed. It was a practiced shame. The shame of a man who has felt it often enough that it sits on him comfortably, like a coat he's broken in. But it was real in some core of it that she could see. He was not a bad man, she thought. He was a man who wanted things he wasn't built to obtain through legitimate means, and had never found a different solution to that problem, and was now, at 50, too habituated to the pattern to break it. She understood the type. She had met variations of it in every world she'd ever navigated. "Tell her I'm sorry," he said. "I will." He looked at her again. That same pause, that same slight frown. "You're very calm today." "I'm always calm," she said, which was not something the original girl had probably ever said, but she needed him to stop looking at her that way, and it worked. He made a sound that was halfway between a laugh and a dismissal and bit into the bread, and the moment passed. She stayed a few more minutes, long enough to seem like a daughter who had come for reasons beyond bread delivery, short enough that she wouldn't have to sustain the performance through actual conversation about a shared history she didn't have. She asked how he was sleeping. He complained about the guards. She nodded. She excused herself. She walked back through cell row 4, past cell row 3, turned into a connector corridor she didn't recognize from the route she'd come in. She stopped, retraced her steps mentally. The guard had said row 4. She'd come from, she turned, recalibrating. The corridor she needed was to the left, and the corridor she was standing in was narrower, branching off at a slight angle that suggested this was not the main prisoner housing but something adjacent to it. Something that had perhaps been added to the original architecture, or repurposed, or... She noticed now that the torches here were absent. Someone had not bothered with this section. The dark was nearly absolute, broken only by the far gray light coming from somewhere around a corner ahead. She should go back. Find the correct corridor. Leave. She went forward instead. The gray light came from a torch bracket that held only a stub, nearly spent, mounted outside a cell at the end of the short passage. The cell itself was otherwise indistinguishable from the others. Same iron bars, same stone alcove, same impersonal institutional permanence. Except this one had a second set of chains. 2 anchor points in the far wall rather than 1, which meant whoever was inside was considered a particular kind of risk. She reached the bars and looked in. He was on the floor rather than the pallet, sitting with his back against the far wall and his legs extended, wrists chained to the anchor points with enough give that he could move his arms to about waist height but no further. His head was down. He was conscious. She could tell by the quality of stillness, which was chosen rather than imposed. But he was doing whatever the equivalent was of not being present. Retreating somewhere internal. She recognized it. She had done it herself in situations that required endurance rather than action. Even in the near dark and the poor posture and the general condition of a man who had been beaten badly enough that his face was still swollen several days later, he was. Striking was perhaps not the right word. Striking implied something active, something that reached out and demanded attention. This was more architectural, the kind of face that simply occupied its proportions with complete authority, as if it had been assembled by someone who understood that a jaw could be a form of argument, and cheekbones could be a kind of position. His dark hair was tangled and fell across his forehead. His gray eyes were closed. Prince Lucien Aquintaine. Villain of the novel. Failed usurper. 30 years old, the oldest son of the king, bastard-born, comprehensively defeated, and currently sitting in a dark cell, waiting to discover what form his punishment would take. As she watched, he shifted, a low groan vibrating deep in his chest. The sound was raw, a physical manifestation of pain that pulled at something buried deep in Layla's psyche. The way the muscles of his forearms strained against the iron, the sweat-slicked sheen of his skin beneath the grime. It was a devastatingly masculine display of vulnerability. Despite the darkness, she could see the slow, heavy rise and fall of his chest, the tattered remnants of a silk shirt clinging to a torso that was built for power, even now. She looked at him for a moment with the same attention she had given the street outside the tenement. The same careful cataloging. Resources, threats, unknowns. In 3 months he would be exiled. He would survive exile. In the novel he was the obstacle, the force that Edward had to overcome to take his rightful throne. But outside the frame of the novel he was simply a man who had backed a strategy and lost, and was now living in the consequences. She did not feel afraid of him. That was worth noting. Other people were afraid of him. The novel had made that clear. His own allies had been afraid of him, in the particular admiring way that fear and respect get compressed together when the object of them is powerful enough. But Layla had grown up around people who were genuinely dangerous, people whose danger was simple and physical and carried no complexity, and whatever Lucien Aquintaine was, he was chained to a wall in the dark. He was not, at this moment, a threat. He was just a man. He was also cold. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the particular controlled tension of someone trying not to shiver, because shivering was a concession to circumstances they had decided not to make. The cell had no blanket. Someone had decided he didn't warrant one, or had removed it as punishment, or simply hadn't thought about it. She looked back at the bread she still had. She'd kept the cloth it was wrapped in after passing the loaf to her father. The cloth was thin and small and not worth anything to anyone. She folded it and pushed it through the bars. It landed silently on the stone 2 feet from him. As she pulled her hand back, his eyes snapped open. They were a piercing, stormy gray, catching the flicker of the dying torch with a predatory intensity that froze her in place. For a heartbeat, the air between them thickened, charged with a sudden, heavy heat that had nothing to do with the temperature of the dungeon. His gaze didn't just see her, it appraised her, tracing the line of her throat and the curve of her mouth with a slow, deliberate focus that felt like a physical touch. She didn't say anything, There wasn't anything to say that would mean anything, and she didn't have the energy for speech as performance. She set it there the way you set a thing down when you want to be sure it's real, and then leave it to be what it is. She walked back to the main corridor and found her way out. The city was louder when she returned to it, the morning having given way to midday, and the streets having filled to their functional capacity with people doing business, with the focused intensity of people for whom the business of daily survival was not metaphorical, but literal. A woman argued with a butcher about the weight of a cut of meat. Two men in merchants' clothing stepped around each other, with the elaborate courtesy of people who hated each other. A horse stood in the middle of the road with magnificent indifference, while the traffic reorganized itself around it. Layla stood at the edge of the street and breathed the cold air, and felt, for the first time since she'd opened her eyes that morning, something that was not quite calm, which was her default register, but something adjacent to it. Not hope. She didn't traffic in hope. It was an expensive currency, and the exchange rate had always been poor for her. But a kind of orientation. She knew where she was. She knew the story she was in, and approximately where in it she'd landed. She knew that in 3 months the scene would shift. The exile. The cold lands. The beginning of whatever came after. She was not the heroine of this story. She was not the woman the novel had bothered to name. She was an NPC, a background figure, a girl with a petty criminal father and a tired mother, and a life that the author had probably included as local color rather than narrative. But she was from 2150. She had survived the slow end of a world. She knew things about cultivation and water management and resource optimization that this world would not discover for a century. She was, it turned out, not nothing. She adjusted her shawl against the cold, feeling the ghost of that heavy, gray-eyed stare still lingering on her skin, and began walking home. Behind her, in a cell she would not think about too carefully, a cloth she'd left through the bars sat on the stone floor 2 feet from a chained man who had not yet moved. Whether he took it or not was not her concern. She had not left it because it mattered. She had left it because it was there, and she was the kind of person who, when something cost nothing and might mean something, did it. That was all. She walked home through the medieval city that smelled of animal and iron and smoke and everything alive, and she did not allow herself to think past the next necessary thing. The well tomorrow morning. The queue at the bread stall. Her father's release. Whenever it came. The walls of the world she'd landed in, slowly becoming solid around her. She was good at survival. She had nothing else to be. 3 months is long enough to learn a place. Layla learned it the way she learned everything. Systematically, without sentiment, starting with what was useful and working outward toward what was merely interesting. She learned the rhythm of the bread queue at the stall 2 streets over, which was shortest on Tuesdays, because the baker's wife was ill, and he baked less, and people had learned not to bother. She learned that the woman in the room above theirs, Dina, a former seamstress whose hands had given out, would trade mending for company on cold evenings, and that this was worth cultivating, because Dina knew everyone in the district, and information was its own currency. She learned which streets flooded when it rained, and which market stalls sold short weight, and which guard rotation at the east gate was most likely to wave you through without questions. She learned her mother. Sarah was not a warm woman. Layla had understood that from the first morning, from the way she wrung the rag and made her annotations and moved through the world with the brisk efficiency of someone who had decided long ago that softness was a resource she couldn't afford. But there was a precision to her care that Layla came to recognize over weeks. The way she always left the better half of the bread for Layla and took the end piece herself, and did it without comment or performance. The way she learned Layla's sleeping patterns without asking, and stopped moving through the room in the early hours. Small adjustments. Invisible ones. The language of people who love in ways that can't survive being named. Layla did not fall in love with her. She was not built for that anymore, if she ever had been. But she came to feel something. A specific gravity toward another person. A preference for her continued existence, that she recognized as the closest thing to attachment she was likely to manage. And then, 6 weeks in, Sarah woke up coughing. It was nothing at first. The kind of cough a cold morning earns you. The kind that sounds worse than it is, and usually is. Layla monitored it with the detached attention of someone taking notes. She added extra water to Sarah's cup without being asked. She traded a piece of embroidery she'd found in the room, left over from the original girl, probably, some abandoned domestic project, for a small parcel of dried herbs from the stall at the corner, whose owner claimed they helped with chest complaints. They helped with chest complaints, the way a cloth through prison bars helped a beaten man. Marginally, perhaps, but only if the help was what you measured rather than the problem. Sarah lasted 5 weeks after the cough started. She went quietly, which seemed right for a woman who had conducted her entire life without demanding to be heard. Layla sat with her through the last night, in the particular silence of a room where someone is leaving, and when it was over, she wrapped her in the better blanket and went to tell the building's landlord and feel, with some distant and tired part of herself, the specific grief of losing a person you had only just begun to understand. She did not weep. She had run out of weeping somewhere in 2150 and had not found where to refill it. She buried Sarah in the common ground outside the city walls, in a plot that cost 2 weeks' earnings from the washing work she'd picked up at a laundress on the main road. She put no marker on it because markers cost extra, but she noted the location precisely, 17 steps from the oak with the split trunk, adjacent to the stone boundary post, and she visited it once, and that was enough. After that, she was alone. Her father was still in the cells. He had been released briefly in the second month, and had appeared at the room door looking sheepish and diminished. And she had let him in and fed him and listened to his plan for a venture that was going to change everything. And when he was done, she had told him calmly that she did not have money to contribute to the venture, and that if he was arrested again before the end of winter, she would not be able to afford the end of winter. She would not be able to afford both food and the cost of visiting him. He had looked at her for a long moment, with the expression of a man encountering something unexpected in a familiar landscape. Then he'd hugged her, brief, uncomfortable, the hug of a person who wanted to do better and hadn't yet found out how, and left. He was back in the cells 3 weeks later. Dice this time. She kept the room. She kept the washing work. She planted 3 small containers of herbs on the windowsill, using techniques she half remembered from a hydroponic module she'd completed in a resource management course in 2145. And she watched them come up green and felt something that was almost satisfaction. She thought about the novel. She thought about Lucien, infrequently, and without the investment of anything she couldn't afford to lose. She had not gone back to that corridor. She had thought about it once, in a weak moment after Sarah died, and had then turned the thought over and set it aside like a tool she didn't currently have use for. He was there. He would continue to be there. The story would proceed the way it intended to, regardless of what she did with her afternoons. She did not think about the cloth. And then one morning she woke to the bells. The bells rang from the palace towers for a full quarter hour, which in Elthidria meant something significant had happened. A death, a war, or a birth. Layla pulled on her boots and went to the window and listened to the city shift and register the way cities do when news moves through them. That specific transformation, from ambient noise to pointed conversation, that happens when everyone receives the same information at once and immediately needs to share it with the nearest person. She was down on the street in 10 minutes and had the information in 15. The queen had delivered a son, first child, healthy, the royal heir, born in the early hours of the morning. The king, gracious, celebrating, performing the particular kind of magnanimity that powerful men perform when they have just been given something they wanted badly, was granting amnesty. Not full amnesty. Not for the violent. Not for the serious criminals. For the petty ones, the debtors, the disorderly, the gamblers and the small-time thieves, and the men who had made insufficient decisions repeatedly and wound up in cells beneath the East Wing. Exile, the crier was saying, moving through the streets with his staff and his proclamation. Those who accepted would be transported to the cold lands, the northern territories beyond the kingdom's border, where they would be free to make what lives they could. They would be escorted to the boundary and left with supplies for a week, and the kingdom's formal good wishes, which everyone understood to mean the kingdom's formal desire never to see them again. Those who accepted had 3 days to prepare. Layla stood in the street and let the noise wash over her, and felt the story click forward like a gear engaging. She went to the cells. Her father had already heard. He was at the bars when she arrived, which was new. He usually sat on the pallet and waited for her to come to him, and his face was doing something complicated, cycling between the excitement of a man who had just been offered something and the guilt of a man who knows the thing he's been offered comes at someone else's cost. "You've heard," he said. "Yes. It's a good opportunity, Layla." His voice had the particular energy of a man who has talked himself into something and needs to finish doing so. "The cold lands aren't what they used to be. People have been building there. I heard from the man in the next cell that there are whole communities now, proper ones. You've already decided," she said. He stopped. Looked at her, had the grace at least, not to pretend otherwise. "Your mother would have," he started. "My mother is dead," she said. Not cruelly, simply. The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the corridor. He looked old in it. The excitement drained out and left the substrate underneath, which was a man who was tired and ashamed and not, she thought, entirely bad, just comprehensively unable to be what the people around him needed. She understood him better now than she had at the start, and the understanding made her feel neither warmer nor colder toward him. It made her feel clear. Clarity was the most honest form of love she had left. "I have no reason to stay," she said. "We'll go." He let out a breath that was almost a sob and then collected himself and pretended it wasn't. "I'll ask them about the arrangements. They'll provide a cart for some families, I was told, for the older ones, and I'll start packing what we have, she said. Come to the room when they release you. She left before he could say anything else that required her to respond to it. She spent 2 days preparing with the focused efficiency she brought to every logistical problem. What they could carry. What was worth carrying. She sorted through the room and made decisions without sentiment, which was easy because almost nothing here had been hers to begin with. It was all inherited, borrowed, the accumulated domestic residue of lives she hadn't lived. She kept the knife. She kept the herb containers, transplanting the seedlings into a folded cloth with dirt packed around the roots, fragile, and probably doomed but worth attempting. She traded the remaining furniture she couldn't carry for coin for dried food for a second pair of boots that actually fit. She was practical and methodical, and when she finally lay down on the last night in the room that had been her life for 3 months, she stared at the cracked ceiling and felt, with some remote and honest part of herself, afraid, not of the cold lands, not of the journey or the unknown or the absence of infrastructure. She had navigated worse unknowns with less. She was afraid of the things she had recognized in herself over these 3 months, the way the world had begun to feel, at its edges, like something she could be in rather than through. The herb seedlings on the windowsill. The particular hour in the evening when the light came through the shutters at an angle that turned the stone floor warm. Dina upstairs, who told long, complicated stories about people Layla had never met and would never meet, and whose voice she had come to wait for in the evenings without meaning to. She was afraid of caring about a place and then being taken from it. She was afraid she was starting to do this again. Live. She told herself it was useful. Adaptation. Survival mechanics. She fell asleep thinking about soil composition and the water table in northern climates, and did not let herself think about anything else. The morning of departure was gray and cold, the sky the color of old pewter, a thin wind moving through the streets and meaning it. The assembled exiles gathered at the east gate, perhaps 40 of them, a ragged miscellany of the kingdom's discarded. Old men, families with children, who didn't fully understand why they were leaving. A few younger ones, men mostly, who'd been drinking when the guards had found them doing whatever had gotten them arrested, and were now reckoning, sober, with the consequences. Her father found her in the crowd and stood beside her with the subdued energy of a man trying to be useful and not yet sure how. She gave him the heavier pack, and he took it without complaint. The guards were organizing the line when the cart came through. She heard it before she saw it, the particular sound of wheels on cobblestone under a heavier load than usual, a slight unevenness to the rhythm that suggested the cargo was not distributed the way cargo usually was. The crowd shifted, and she let it shift her, and then she had a line of sight, and she saw what was on the cart, and felt something move through her that was not quite surprise. He was tied to the flatbed rather than chained, which she understood to be a logistical compromise rather than a mercy. You couldn't transport a man in manacles for a week on the road without it becoming a problem of wounds and infection. He lay on his back, with his wrists bound above him to the front board, and his ankles to the back, and he had been beaten again, recently, which she could see in the fresh damage overlaid on the older, partially healed damage from 3 months ago. His eyes were closed. His chest rose and fell with the slow, deliberate rhythm of someone who was unconscious or close to it. Around her, the crowd had gone quiet in the way crowds go quiet when something frightening is present, and they are trying to determine whether they are allowed to react to it. Then the second cart came through, a donkey, small and unimpressed by its situation. A flat cart piled with supplies, bags, rolls of canvas, a wooden chest, various bundles tied with rope, and driving it, sitting with the posture of a woman who had decided that posture was a form of argument and intended to win, Mara. Layla had built a picture of her from the novel, but the novel, she now understood, had flattened her. Descriptions on a page gave you dimensions without mass. The woman on the cart had mass. She occupied space differently than the people around her, with a particular economy of authority that didn't advertise itself because it didn't need to. She was perhaps 50, dark-haired with threads of gray she had not attempted to conceal, with a face that had once been beautiful and had become, through the years, something more durable and more interesting than beautiful. Her eyes moved through the crowd the way Layla's moved through a room, cataloging, assessing, noting what was useful and filing everything else. She pulled the cart to a stop beside the flatbed, where her son was tied. Said something to the guard nearest to her, in a tone that was quiet enough that Layla couldn't hear it from where she stood. But the guard's posture shifted immediately in response, and then 2 of them were transferring Lucien from the flatbed to Mara's cart, with the careful, slightly wary energy of people handling something valuable that they had been told not to damage further. Layla watched Mara watch this happen. She watched her watch her son, unconscious, damaged, being moved like cargo, and she saw what was in Mara's face for the 2 seconds before she put it away. It was not a comfortable thing to see. Grief that has been compressed for years into something functional and forward-moving, that has learned to power rather than paralyze. She recognized it. It was not so different from what she saw when she looked at herself too directly. Then Mara's eyes moved and found her. It was not coincidence. Layla understood immediately that it was not coincidence. The woman had been moving through the crowd with her gaze before Lucien had been transferred, cataloging as Layla cataloged, and she had arrived at Layla the way a calculation arrives at its answer, with the satisfaction of something confirmed rather than discovered. Layla did not look away. There was nothing to look away from. She met the gaze and held it with the same steady attention she would have given a neutral entity whose intent was not yet established. Mara's expression did not change, but something in it settled, infinitesimally, like a thing that has been waiting to be certain, and has now been given what it needed. She did not see it happen. She learned about it from her father, who learned it from the man beside him, who had been close enough to witness. Mara had spoken to Edric while Layla was helping an elderly woman retie a pack that kept slipping from her shoulders. Whatever Mara had said to him, whatever she had offered, had taken perhaps 4 minutes. Coin, probably. A significant amount, based on the way her father looked when he found her afterward. He could not meet her eyes. "Layla," he said. And then stopped. She looked at him, at the way he was holding his own hands, pressing one thumb hard into the other palm the way he did when he was about to ask for something he knew he shouldn't. "What did you do?" she said. Not a question. "It's a good arrangement," he said, which was not an answer, and they both knew it. "She's a woman of means, and her son needs. What did you do? You'll be taken care of." His voice had the quality of a man finishing an argument he'd had with himself, bringing out the conclusions without the workings. "Better than I can manage." "You'll have. You sold me," she said. He flinched. The word landed the way truth does when it's been dressed up in justifications for long enough and finally gets to appear undressed. It's not. She needs a wife for him, someone who can manage the journey, and afterward, someone who can. "Where is the priest?" she said. He blinked. "What? She'll want it done before we leave the city. Where is the priest?" He stared at her, at the calm in her face, which was not the calm he'd expected, not the storm he'd expected after the calm, just the calm, extending flatly in all directions. "I thought you'd," he started. "Where is the priest?" she said again, and her voice was even and entirely final, and he pointed. The priest was young and cold and visibly wanted to be somewhere else, which put him in the same position as most of the people present. The ceremony took 7 minutes. Lucien was unconscious through all of it, lying in Mara's cart with a blanket over him that had not been there before, his bound wrists resting on his chest. Mara stood beside the cart and answered on his behalf in a tone that suggested this was a formality she was completing, rather than a moment she was experiencing. Layla stood in the cold morning and said the words she was told to say. She felt, while she said them, absolutely nothing, which was not the same as feeling nothing about the situation. She felt a great deal about the situation, a layered, complicated arrangement of emotion that she was not currently interested in sorting through. She felt the specific anger of a person who has been moved without being consulted. She felt something colder underneath it that was almost respect, or at least recognition. Mara had assessed the available material and made a decision in under 10 minutes that would shape the rest of her son's life, and had done it without flinching, and whatever else that was, it was not nothing. Mostly, she felt the thing she had felt on the last night in the room, afraid, not of him, not of what a marriage to a beaten, unconscious former prince in a cart meant in practical terms. She had a working understanding of what it meant in practical terms, and was not afraid of bodies or their requirements. She had navigated that particular landscape before, and had her own methods of determining what she would and wouldn't accept. She was afraid because she had decided, 3 months ago, that she was passing through, that this was another temporary landscape, another situation to survive until the next one. She had decided not to invest herself, not to take root. And then she had left bread through a cell door for a man she didn't know, for no reason that she could explain in terms of strategy or survival, for a reason that had no name except the oldest one. And here she was. She looked at him while the priest finished. In daylight, battered and unconscious, he was still, that word again, she noticed, returning to her architectural. Even diminished, even tied to a cart in the middle of a prisoner convoy. She did not know what that meant yet. She didn't have the information. The priest finished. Mara thanked him with a coin and a nod. Her father touched Layla's shoulder, and she stepped away from the touch before she could stop herself, and his hand fell. "You'll be all right," he said. He needed it to be true. "Yes," she said, because it was probably true, and because kindness, at this particular moment, cost her nothing. The convoy began to move. She climbed up onto Mara's cart and sat at the end, near Lucien's feet, and watched the city gates pass overhead as the road opened up and the cold lands waited somewhere ahead of them. past everything that had been and before everything that hadn't happened yet. Beside her, the man she had just married breathed slowly and did not wake. She pulled her shawl tighter and watched the road. It was not a road so much as an intention. In the capital, it had been paved, flat gray stone, worn smooth by centuries of cartwheels and foot traffic, bordered by drainage channels, and maintained by men whose entire occupation was its maintenance. By the second day out of the city, it had become packed earth, and by the third day, it had become a suggestion. 2 tracks worn into the ground by enough previous passage to constitute a direction, bordered on both sides by scrub forest that grew closer as the days passed and the settlements thinned, and the sense of being inside the kingdom's attention gradually gave way to the sense of being outside it entirely. The escort was 12 soldiers. Not a punitive number, not a protective one, just enough to prevent the convoy from turning around, and not enough to make anyone feel cared for. Their captain was a man of about 45 named Harwick, who had the face of someone who had been given an assignment he found professionally insulting, and was managing his feelings about it through rigid adherence to logistics. He communicated with the convoy through a corporal named Dav, who was young enough to still find the whole thing interesting, and passed between the groups with the slightly overeager energy of someone who hasn't yet learned that being useful to everyone means being nobody's ally. 41 exiles. Layla counted them on the first morning and kept the count updated as the days passed. She lost 2 on the 4th day, when a couple with 3 children, unable to face the unknown, slipped away into the woods before dawn, and presumably made their way back toward the city and whatever mercy it might offer them. Harwick noted their absence with the expression of a man deciding whether a problem was worth the energy of becoming one, concluded it wasn't, and the column moved on. The others were a cross-section of the kingdom's discarded. A blacksmith, Orvin, enormous and quiet, who had been imprisoned for breaking a nobleman's jaw over a payment dispute and carried himself with the careful dignity of a man who knew he was being watched for signs of violence and had decided to disappoint everyone. A woman named Hesta, perhaps 60, who had been a moneylender and had run afoul of a client with more influence than debt, and who walked every day without complaint and refused every offer of a place on a cart with the iron pride of someone for whom independence was the last thing she owned. Several families with children in various states of bewilderment and adaptability. Children, Layla observed, were better at this than their parents on the whole, primarily because they had less invested in the idea that circumstances were supposed to be otherwise. Her father walked at the middle of the column and tried, with visible and touching effort, to make himself useful. He was good with the children, she discovered. Patient in a way he had apparently not been able to sustain through the grinding years of his own domestic life, but which emerged now in short bursts with other people's offspring, playing simple games, keeping them walking when they flagged. She watched this without the resentment she'd expected to feel, and felt instead something more complicated and less satisfying, which was the recognition that people contain more than the damage they've caused. She rode on Mara's cart and managed Lucien. Managing Lucien in these first days was a largely physical project. He had 3 broken ribs, she established on the first evening when she unwrapped the cloth around his torso, and catalogued the damage with the systematic attention of someone who had done field medicine under conditions that made this look uncomplicated. The ribs she could do little about, except wrap them again tightly, and make sure he was positioned, so the movement of the cart jostle was distributed as evenly as possible. His left eye was swollen shut. His lower lip was split, and had been allowed to heal improperly, and would probably scar. There were older injuries layered under the new ones. A long-healed break in his right forearm that had knit well, a scar along his collarbone from something edged, and the accumulated picture was of a man who had spent 30 years in situations that had opinions about him. She cleaned what needed cleaning. She changed the wrappings. She got water into him when he was conscious enough to swallow, which in the first days was only briefly and without awareness, the body drinking on instinct while the person remained somewhere else. Mara watched her do this with the evaluating attention she brought to everything. "You've done this before," she said on the second evening. It was not a question. "Some version of it," Layla said. Mara handed her a small clay pot from the wooden chest. "Comfrey and rendered fat, for the bruising." She paused. "His ribs? 3. Maybe 4. The lower left ones." Mara's jaw tightened, briefly, and then relaxed. "His brother's guards were thorough." "Yes," Layla said. They didn't speak again that evening, but the silence had a different quality to it than it had before. Less assessment, more something that was not quite ease but was moving in that direction. He became conscious on the 5th day. Not gradually. That was the thing she hadn't expected. She'd anticipated the slow surfacing she'd seen before in injured people, the incremental return of awareness over hours. Instead, she was checking the wrappings on his ribs and looked up and found his eyes open, both of them. The swollen one only partially, a thin gray slit, and fully present. Watching her, with an attention that was, even diminished, even still half-wrecked, immediately and completely arresting. She did not startle. She held the look and finished securing the wrapping and said, "Good morning." His mouth moved. Nothing came out. She held the water to his lips and he drank, and the effort of it crossed his face clearly before he locked it down. "Where?" he said. The word came out rough, scraped clean of anything but function. "North Road, 5 days from the capital." She sat back. "Your mother is driving. You're in her cart." His eyes moved, taking in the canvas above him, the motion of the cart, the light coming through the gap at the rear. She watched him construct the situation from available information, watched the conclusions arrive. "The amnesty," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. His throat moved. "My brother." She didn't answer that because it wasn't a question that needed one. His brother was on his throne with his new heir and his commemorative amnesty, and Lucien was in a cart on a dirt road heading to the edge of the world. The answer was in everything around them. "Who are you?" he said. "Layla." He looked at her. The single working eye was the gray she'd noted through the cell bars months ago, sharp despite everything. The kind of eye that had likely never been entirely off, even unconscious. "Why are you on this cart?" She considered several ways to answer this. "Your mother arranged it," she said, which was accurate and complete without being detailed. He seemed to decide that this was sufficient for now. He closed his eyes, opened them again almost immediately, as if sleep were something he was refusing on principle. "The ribs, 3 broken, possibly 4. I know." A pause. "It's the left lower ones that are the problem." "Yes, I've wrapped them." I felt. Something that was not quite a wry expression crossed his damaged face, gone before it fully arrived, but she caught it. "You're not gentle." "I'm precise," she said. "They're different things." He looked at her again, that same quality of recalibration she'd seen in her father 3 months ago, the slight adjustment when something behaved unexpectedly. Then he closed his eyes, and this time they stayed closed, and she went back to watching the road and listening to the trees. He mended the way she'd expected him to mend, faster than was reasonable, driven by a will that treated the body's limitations as a negotiating position rather than a fact. By the 8th day he was sitting up. By the 10th he had shifted himself to the edge of the cart and was watching the forest with the focused attention of a man taking inventory. The days had their own difficult texture. The road was unpredictable, soft in places where underground water had undermined it, rutted in others from previous carts, occasionally blocked by fallen trees that required the whole column to stop while men cleared them. The weather shifted between sullen gray cold and outright rain that turned the track to mud and made every mile a negotiation. Food was rationed from the supply cart, and sufficient but not generous, the kind of eating that keeps you functional without ever letting you feel full. 2 of the older exiles fell ill, a respiratory thing that moved through the column in the 2nd week, taking Layla's father among its casualties, rattling his chest in a way that sounded like Sarah's cough, and made her watch him at night with a vigilance she didn't name. Small cruelties accumulated. One of the soldiers, a thick-necked man named Pellet, enjoyed the authority of the situation in ways that Harwick technically discouraged and practically allowed. Small humiliations, the selective enforcement of petty rules, the particular pleasure some men take in having people who can't tell them no. Layla watched him and noted his patterns and stored the information with the patience of someone who understood that most problems solve themselves if you wait long enough and help them a little. Orvin the blacksmith watched Pellet too, with the careful stillness of a man counting to a number he hadn't reached yet. On the 12th night, Pellet took the better share of Hesta's ration, citing a rule that nobody else had heard of, and Hesta said nothing because she was 60 and alone and had correctly assessed the situation. Layla came to Harwick that evening with the quiet courtesy of someone reporting a logistical error and suggested, in neutral and unaccusatory terms, that inconsistent rationing was creating inefficiencies in the column's morale and pace. Harwick looked at her for a moment, then at Pellet, then back at her, and made the calculation. The next morning, Pellet was moved to rear guard, and a different soldier handled rations. Hesta said nothing to Layla about it, but the next morning she fell into step beside her for an hour and told her things about the road ahead, which she'd apparently traveled once in her youth, that were practically useful. Information for information. The currency Layla understood best. It was the 14th night when Lucien came to her. They had made camp in a clearing where the forest opened briefly, and the tents were small and shared, one for every 4 or 5 people, with Mara having arranged a separate canvas shelter for herself adjacent to the cart. Whether out of genuine need for privacy or to engineer a situation, Layla had not yet decided. She was in the shelter they shared, the shared warmth a practical necessity rather than a choice, lying in the dark and listening to the forest and the camp's settling sounds when she heard him move. He'd been mobile for 3 days, in limited ways. Short distances, controlled movements that cost him, and which he paid without expression. She had watched him stand at the cart's edge and look at the tree line with the specific attention of a man in the early stages of planning something, and had not asked about it because she had learned that Lucien processed things in a forward direction and would tell her what was relevant when it was relevant. He lowered himself onto the pallet beside her in the dark, moving slowly, the pain in his ribs audible in the quality of his breathing if you knew how to listen. The scent of him, damp wool, wood smoke, and the sharp metallic tang of healing blood hit her before he did. She was on her back looking at the canvas above her. She didn't turn. "You should be resting," she said. "I've been resting for 2 weeks," he said. His voice was closer than she'd expected. He was perhaps a foot away, maybe less. "You have broken ribs. I'm aware." Silence. The forest outside. Somewhere distant, an owl. "My mother told me what she paid for you," he said. "Did she?" "She told me what she saw." A pause. "The bread." Layla said nothing. "At the cell," he said. 3 months ago. She saw you leave it." She hadn't known that. She filed it away without reacting to it. "You didn't know who I was," he said. It wasn't quite a question. She considered lying and discarded it. He was, she had already understood, an exceptional judge of character. Lying to him would be a structural error, the kind of thing you could do once and never recover. "I knew who you were," she said. "I left it anyway." Another silence. She could feel him thinking beside her, the particular quality of attention he gave to things that required reassessment. "Why?" he said. "Because it was there," she said. "And it cost nothing." He was quiet for a long time. The camp outside shifted and settled. She heard his breathing adjust, still controlled, still expensive, but different. Then he said, very quietly, "Look at me." She turned her head. In the darkness, she could see the shape of him more than the detail, the line of his jaw, the gray eyes catching what little light filtered through the canvas. The damage was still visible, the healing bruising a shadow across his face, but the quality of his attention was undamaged entirely. It had probably never been damaged. She suspected it was the thing most central to him, the last thing that would go. He looked at her the way he looked at everything, with the patience of a man who had decided that what he saw when he waited long enough was always more accurate than what he saw first. He looked at her like she was a landscape he was memorizing. Her pulse did what it did when something true was happening. She noticed it without judgment. "You're not afraid of me," he said. "No. Everyone is afraid of me." "I know," she said. "You find it useful." Something moved in his expression. Surprise, quickly followed by something that might have been the beginning of respect. "Yes," he said. "I do." He reached out, slow, deliberate, the way he did everything, and his hand came to the side of her face, rough thumb along her jaw, and the touch was not tentative. It was certain in the way that he was certain, the way a man touches something when he has made a decision and is not interested in revisiting it. She felt it everywhere. That was the honest account. She felt it in the way that she had not allowed herself to feel things for long enough, that her body had apparently been keeping a list, and was now presenting the bill. Her skin hummed where he touched her, a low-voltage vibration that made her breath hitch. "We are married," he said, low. Almost dry. "Apparently," she said. "I'd like to know my wife." She reached up and covered his hand with hers, and felt the heat of his skin against her palm. The calluses on his fingers, a rough map of a life she was only beginning to understand. "Then know her," she whispered. What followed was not tender. She hadn't wanted tender, and he hadn't offered it, and the honesty of that was its own kind of relief. No performance. No pretense that this was something other than two people choosing each other in the dark, for reasons that were partly practical and partly animal, and entirely real. He was careful with his ribs out of necessity and not at all careful with her, which she appreciated. He paid attention. The focused, total attention he apparently brought to everything. And she learned, in those hours, that being the object of Lucien Aquintaine's complete concentration was a specific and substantial experience. He touched her like he was reading something he intended to understand, every response noted and filed and returned to. She was not a woman who made noise easily, and she made noise. A ragged, desperate sound when his mouth found the sensitive curve of her neck, his teeth grazing her skin just hard enough to leave a mark. He said very little, which turned out to be more than enough. A low, guttural word at her ear that was partly instruction and partly something rawer, something she felt in her spine. The grit of the pallet beneath them, the chill of the air against her damp skin, the crushing weight of him. It was all sharp and visceral, and more alive than anything she had felt in the sterile tomb of 2150. His broken ribs made certain things complicated. They solved the problems with the pragmatic creativity of people who are good at logistics and currently very motivated. When she rose above him in the dark, her knees sinking into the straw, and his hands gripped her hips with a certainty that bordered on demanding, she looked down at him, at the gray eyes watching her, at the sharp planes of his face, at the focused and entirely undone quality of his expression, and felt something shift inside her that she recognized and had not expected. Not love, not yet. She was not naive about what things were and were not, but want, clean and specific and hers, want that didn't require anything else to justify it. She leaned down, her hair falling like a curtain around them, and kissed him, a hard, bruising collision of lips and tongues that tasted of wood smoke and salt. Afterward, she lay beside him in the dark, and her breathing slowed, and the forest outside continued its indifferent business, and she was aware, in the particular clarity that follows physical honesty, of his arm against hers where they touched in the narrow space. He didn't sleep immediately. She could feel the quality of his wakefulness, thinking, always thinking. "You don't behave like anyone I've met," he said. Not a complaint. An observation. The tone of a man updating a model. "No," she agreed. "Why not?" She considered this. "I've seen enough that most things don't shock me." "What have you seen?" "Enough," she said. He accepted this the way he seemed to accept most of her non-answers, not as deflection, but as data. The boundary itself told him something. She could feel him noting it. "The cold lands," he said after a while. "What do you know about them?" "Rocky. Cold. Short growing season. Limited natural water sources in some regions, better in others depending on elevation. People have been settling the southern edge for a generation. Mostly independently. No real governance structure." A pause. She felt him turn his head to look at her in the dark. "You know a great deal." "I read," she said, which was true, and which satisfied him, and which covered a complexity she was not ready to explain. He was quiet for a moment. "We'll need food sources before the first winter." "Yes. The supply they're giving us won't last 3 weeks. No. 10 days if we're careful." "I can hunt," he said. "When I can ride again." He said it without drama, simply. As a logistical contribution, itemized. "I've hunted northern territories before. The game is different, but the principle holds." She thought about this. About him on a horse moving through the gray forest with the patient, focused attention he brought to everything, reading the ground the way he read a room. "There are cultivable areas even in hard soil," she said. "With the right technique, you can grow food in conditions most people consider unusable. I know some of those techniques." Another pause. Longer this time. "My mother," he said carefully, "said you had intelligent eyes. Your mother is perceptive." "She is never wrong," he said. "It's her most exhausting quality." She heard something in it. Affection compressed so tightly it barely showed, but present. She stored it. "Sleep," she said. "Your ribs need the hours." He didn't argue, which told her the ribs hurt more than he was indicating. She felt him shift, a careful, controlled rearrangement, and then settle, and after a while his breathing changed and he slept. She lay in the dark and looked at the canvas above her and felt the warmth of him beside her, and thought about cultivable soil and water tables and the specific gravity of things you hadn't meant to begin. He was on a horse by the 18th day. Harwick had objected, technically. Lucien was not a guard, was in fact a convicted traitor, and the horse in question belonged to the escort. He made his objection to Layla because Lucien had simply taken the horse, and Harwick had apparently calculated the risk of the direct conversation and found it unfavorable. Layla listened to the objection with the courtesy it deserved, and then said, in a tone that was helpful and completely immovable, that a man who could ride could also scout the road ahead, which benefited everyone, and that the horse would be returned each evening, and that Harwick's report on the convoy's progress would presumably reflect well on creative resource deployment. Harwick looked at her with the expression of a man recognizing a sentence structure he'd encountered before, and not being able to identify where. He let it go. Lucien rode out that first morning with a short bow he'd acquired from somewhere. She didn't ask. She suspected Mara, and came back 3 hours later with 2 rabbits and a look on his face that was as close to ease as she had yet seen on him. He dropped them in front of her without ceremony. "Can you do something with those?" "Yes," she said. "Good." He dismounted, controlled and a little slow on the left side where the ribs were. She noted it. He knew she noted it. Neither of them said anything, and handed the reins to a guard who took them with the bemused expression of a man unsure how he'd ended up being helpful. That night the exiles ate hot food. Not much, not enough, but hot and real and better than the dried ration, and the quality of the camp that evening was different. Less the sound of people enduring, and more the sound of people slightly improbably living. Orvin sat near her fire and ate without speaking. But when he was done, he nodded at her with the particular gravity of a large and reserved man paying a compliment, which she received in the spirit it was offered. Her father, recovered enough from his chest complaint to sit up and eat, looked at Lucien across the fire, and then looked at Layla, and she watched him understand, with the delayed clarity of a man who makes decisions before he comprehends them, what he had actually sold when he'd sold her. Not a girl to be rid of. Not a problem handed off. Something that was arranging itself, steadily and without asking permission, into something else entirely. He said nothing. He ate his rabbit and stared into the fire, and had the grace, for once, to let a thing be what it was becoming. Lucien sat at the edge of the firelight, close enough to be present, far enough to see everything, and sharpened the hunting knife Mara had given him and didn't look at Layla with any frequency, which was different from not being aware of her. She felt the awareness the way you feel a fire's heat, not looking at it directly, but present in the temperature of the air. 4 more days to the border, Harwick had said. She looked at the fire and listened to the forest and felt the cold at her back, and the warmth in front, and thought, 4 more days, then the real thing starts. The soldiers left them on a Tuesday. Layla knew it was Tuesday because she had been counting days with the methodical attention she brought to everything that mattered, scratching a small mark each morning into the leather of her belt with the tip of her dull knife. 22 marks meant Tuesday, the 22nd day since leaving the capital, the day the road ended, and so did the kingdom's interest in them. The border was not dramatic. She had expected something, a wall, a marker, some physical declaration of where one thing stopped and another began. What there was instead was a wooden post half rotted into the ground at the edge of a clearing, with a faded carving of the Elthydrian crest on its face, and nothing on the other side. The forest continued beyond it, identically to the forest behind it. The sky was the same gray. The wind had no opinion about jurisdictions. Harwick stopped the column at the post and read from a paper in the flat, conclusive tone of a man completing a task he was glad to be finishing. The formal language of exile. By the grace of the Crown, in recognition of the royal amnesty, the aforementioned parties are hereby released from custody and granted freedom to establish themselves within the northern territories. The week's supplies were unloaded from the rear cart and stacked in the clearing with the brisk efficiency of people who did not intend to be present long enough for it to become a conversation. Each family received a portion in burlap, dried grain, salt, a small amount of preserved meat, a sealed pot of rendered fat. Then Harwick folded his paper, mounted his horse, and looked at the assembled 39 people in the clearing, with the expression of a man who has made his peace with something and would prefer not to revisit it. He looked very briefly at Lucien. Lucien was on the borrowed horse at the edge of the group. They'd given him that, at least at the end, given or not asked for back. And he met Harwick's look with the flat, neutral attention he gave to things he had already assessed and filed. Something moved between them that was not quite acknowledgement and not quite threat. The recognition of 2 men who understood each other's capacity without needing to demonstrate it. Harwick turned his horse south. The column of soldiers followed. The exiles watched them go in silence. Then the silence continued a beat, longer than silence usually does before someone fills it, and in that beat, Layla watched 39 people. Her father among them, Mara standing still beside her cart. Orvan's enormous shape at the back absorbed the reality of where they were and what it meant. She watched it move through them like weather. Some of the children started crying, the sound of it thin and immediate in the cold air. One of the women sat down on the ground and covered her face. A man began talking too loudly about the supplies, the tone of someone filling space, because the alternative was unbearable. Lucien dismounted. He did it without announcement, without preparation, without the deliberate performance of authority. He simply got off the horse and walked to the supply pile and began sorting it with the same focused efficiency he brought to everything. And the quality of his movement in the space, the particular way he occupied it, the way his attention structured the area around him, had an immediate gravitational effect. People who had been spiraling inward toward their own panic turned outward toward him the way compass needles turn north, not because he asked them to, because purposeful motion in a directionless moment is one of the most powerful things one human being can offer another. Orvan, he said, without looking up, the trees to the northeast are denser. Wind breaks better in that direction. Take 2 people and find where the ground stays driest. Orvan moved immediately, tapping 2 younger men on the shoulder as he went. Hesta, she looked up sharply at her name. Count the grain. I need exact quantities before we discuss rationing. Hesta moved to the supplies, with the focused energy of a woman given a task commensurate with her actual abilities. He went through the group methodically, not barking orders, not performing command, simply identifying what needed doing and matching it to the person most suited to do it, with the accuracy of someone who had been watching people for 22 days and paying attention. Layla watched him work and thought about the novel's description of him. Brilliant strategist, feared in battle, calculating, and understood now that these words had been built from his failures, from the threat he'd posed to Edward's throne, and had therefore been painted in villain's colors when the thing itself was more neutral than that, more useful than that. He was a man who understood systems, who could look at 39 frightened people in a cold clearing and see not the fear but the structure underneath it, the resources, the capacities, the dependencies, and begin immediately to build something from the material available. It was, she thought, genuinely remarkable. He reached her last. You said there are cultivable areas in hard soil, he said. No preamble. They had been talking for a week in the shorthand of people who have established that complete sentences are often inefficient. Yes, I need to look at what's here, before I can tell you what's possible. How long? Give me the afternoon. He nodded. Take my horse. She took the horse. The land north of the border post had, if you knew how to look at it, more to offer than its surface suggested. She rode for 2 hours in expanding circles from the campsite Orvin had identified. A reasonable choice, she noted, sheltered on 2 sides by a natural ridge of granite, close enough to a stream to be practical, far enough from the tree line to allow expansion. And what she found was a landscape that was not generous, but was not entirely hostile either. The soil in the open areas was thin and rocky, the kind that would defeat conventional planting. But in 3 locations, she found what she was looking for, places where the drainage pattern had deposited richer sediment over years, darker patches in the gray earth where organic matter had accumulated. Not farmland. Something that could become farmland with intervention. More importantly, she found the stream's source, a spring emerging from the granite ridge, consistent and clean. Water was not going to be the limiting factor, which changed the calculation significantly. She returned to camp with her notes organized in her head, and found that in her absence the camp had become, in the most provisional sense, a camp. Orvin and his people had felled 3 smaller trees and begun a windbreak structure. 2 of the women had set up the cooking arrangements with impressive efficiency. Mara had positioned her cart to create a windbreak for the supply stack, and was in conversation with a thin, nervous man named Fosse, who had apparently at some point in his former life been a builder. Lucien was crouched by the stream with a piece of bark, drawing something in mud with a stick. She dismounted and went to him and looked at what he'd drawn. A layout, rough but readable, the camp at center, the stream, the ridge, estimated distances marked in scratches. The kind of thing a military man makes automatically when he enters a new territory, turning geography into a problem with a solution. She crouched beside him and added 3 marks to his drawing, pointing to each. Here, here, and here. The soil is workable with the right preparation. This one, she tapped the northernmost mark, is the best. Good sediment layer. Drainage from 2 directions. About 1/3 of an acre before the rock shelf starts. He studied it. Timeline. If we start now, first plantings possible in 2 weeks, if we prepare the ground immediately. Nothing edible for 6 weeks minimum after that, probably 8. We need to cover that gap. Hunting and what we have, he said. He had been hunting every day, ranging further as his ribs allowed more of what riding required of him. He hadn't come back empty-handed yet. She had noted this without commenting on it because he didn't need her commentary and the results spoke with adequate clarity. I'll need to go further north. The game near camp will thin out as we settle. The spring attracts animals, she said. Early morning and evening, upstream from where we're drawing water. If we don't overhunt that range, we can maintain a consistent supply close to camp. He looked at her in the way she had become familiar with, that specific quality of attention, adding what she gave him to what he already had, updating. You know a great deal about land management for someone who grew up in a city. I learned it later, she said. He let it sit there, unanswered, the way he let all her non-answers sit, not accepting them as complete but not forcing them open. He had a patience with her specific opacity that she found, if she was being honest, more disarming than pressure would have been. Pressure she knew how to resist. Patience she had fewer defenses against. Show me the best site tomorrow, he said. Before I ride out. All right. He looked back at his map, then, without looking up. You're cold. You've been riding for 2 hours and you didn't take the blanket. I was fine. You're shivering. She became aware, now that he'd said it, that she was in fact shivering, small, controlled, the kind her body did when she'd pushed past the point of comfortable cold without noticing, which she did when she was focused on a problem. I'm fine, she said again, which was both true and beside the point. He stood, pulled off his outer coat, and put it around her shoulders in a single motion that was entirely without ceremony, the way he did things he'd decided to do. It was heavy and warm and smelled of wood smoke and the specific outdoor cold of a man who spent his days in forest. She didn't thank him. He didn't expect it. She pulled it tighter, and they walked back to camp together in the early evening dark, his map in his hand, the settlement's first cooking fire, sending a thin line of smoke up into the gray sky ahead of them. The first 2 weeks were the hardest. Layla would think about this later. Not the cold land's hardest, not hardest overall, but the particular difficulty of a period when the gap between what you need and what you have is most visible, before the work has had time to show results. Everyone felt it differently. Some people became quieter, turned inward, conserved themselves. Some became louder, more fractious. The specific irritability of cold and hungry people who have lost their previous framework for understanding their own lives. A man named Corwick got into 3 separate arguments in the first week that were technically about food distribution, and actually about fear, which is what most arguments are about. Lucien handled these with the economy of a man who had commanded frightened soldiers. He listened to the first argument. He resolved it. He made the resolution public so that everyone understood the framework. The second argument he interrupted with a look that Layla observed from across the camp with considerable interest. Not a threat exactly, nothing so crude. Just the focused weight of his attention applied to a person who was rapidly reassessing whether they wanted to continue, and they did not. The third argument he delegated to Orvin, who settled it with 3 words and his physical presence, which were sometimes the same thing. She respected the methodology. It was efficient without being brutal, which she'd half expected from the novel's description of him. The novel had made him a tyrant. What he was in practice was something more precise. A man who used exactly as much force as a situation required and stopped there, which was actually considerably rarer and more difficult than either cruelty or softness. She worked the soil sites. She started alone, breaking the ground with a mattock she'd found in the camp supplies, working in the early mornings before the light fully established itself, when the cold was at its worst and her breath came in clouds, and the sound of the iron on frozen topsoil was flat and sharp and specific. 3 days of this produced her hands in a state she considered objectively, flexing them in the morning with the same detachment she gave to mechanical assessments. Blisters she'd expected. The muscles across her shoulders and back she'd expected. The particular satisfaction she had not entirely expected. The physical proof of work in a body that she was, slowly and without ceremony, beginning to understand as hers. Orvin came on the 4th morning. He didn't ask, and she didn't invite him. He simply appeared at the field with a second mattock, and began working the adjacent section with the methodical power of a man built for exactly this kind of task. They worked in silence for 2 hours, which was the best kind of working arrangement, and when Layla stopped to assess the progress and do the geometry on remaining ground versus available time, Orvin looked at what she was calculating and said, 2 more people. I know who. He brought them the next day. And the day after that, there were 5 of them, then 8, the group expanding by the logic of visible progress. People who could see a field taking shape are more willing to be part of it than people being asked to imagine one. She taught them what she knew, not everything at once, not with the condescension of revelation, but in the practical sequence of information that builds on itself. Why the soil was being turned to this depth and not shallower. Why the composting arrangement she'd set up at the camp edge mattered. How to build the simple raised bed framework from the wood offcuts that gave the seedlings a microclimate 2 degrees warmer than the ambient air. Some of it she translated into terms they'd understand. What she knew as hydroponics, she called tight bed planting. What she knew as companion planting from integrated biology, she called the way some plants help each other. The principles survived the translation. The results were what mattered. Lucien rode out hunting most mornings and came back most afternoons, and spent his evenings managing the community with the focused, slightly grim dedication of a man who has found his actual purpose in circumstances he hadn't chosen. She watched the exile's relationship with him change over these 2 weeks. The initial wariness giving way to something more complex, a mixture of respect and reliance that was not the court's performance of deference but something more real. He fed them. He organized them. He made decisions that nobody else wanted to make, and he made them without enjoying the power of it, which was, she had come to understand, the only kind of decision-making that could be trusted. One evening she came back from the field to find him sitting outside their shelter cleaning the hunting knife, and her father sitting nearby attempting to whittle something that was not yet any identifiable shape. They were not talking. They were just occupying the same space with the careful non-aggression of 2 people who have found an arrangement they can both tolerate. It was not warmth. It was something more achievable than warmth and more honest. 2 people in the same situation, managing. She stood at the edge of the firelight and watched it for a moment. Her father looked up and saw her, and the expression that crossed his face was the particular one he'd been wearing since the border, a combination of gratitude and shame, and something that was working its way, slowly, toward being better than either. He had been useful these 2 weeks, she had noted with the fairness she tried to maintain even about people she had complicated feelings toward. He had an ease with people that was its own kind of skill, a social intelligence entirely inconsistent with his ability to manage the practical dimensions of his life, and he had deployed it here naturally, smoothing frictions, making people laugh when they were close to not, remembering names and children's names and the small personal details that make a person feel seen. It did not undo what he'd done. It was, nevertheless, something. Lucien looked up from the knife, looked at her with the gray eyes that she had stopped being able to look at without feeling the specific awareness of a person whose guard has been partially and inconveniently breached. "There's food," he said. "Hesta kept your portion." She went and got it, and ate beside him, and felt, with the part of herself that insisted on honest accounts, the ordinary, extraordinary thing of a meal at the end of a hard day next to a person whose presence had become, without her authorizing it, something she oriented toward. It was 3 weeks in, when she showed him the spring. She had been going there in the early mornings, before camp woke, before the day made its demands, sitting on the granite shelf above where the water emerged, and letting the sound of it do whatever sound does when you're tired and need something that isn't people or problems. It was the closest thing she had to privacy, which was a resource as scarce as salt in a settlement of 39 people living in close quarters. She found him there one morning, standing at the shelf's edge, looking north into the trees. His back was to her. She stopped. He said, without turning, "You come here." She had been quiet, approaching, not silent enough, apparently. "Yes," she said. "In the mornings, yes." He turned then. He was in his hunting clothes, the leather coat, the rough boots, the bow across his back, and the early light was flat and pale and turned his face to angles. "What are you thinking about?" he said. "Not what do you think about here. What are you thinking about?" Present tense. "Right now." She looked at the spring. "Irrigation channels," she said. "If we run 2 channels from the source to the lower field, gravity does the work. We don't have to carry water." He was quiet for a moment. Then something happened in his expression that she had been seeing more often these past weeks. A kind of loosening, brief and almost involuntary, the expression of a man whose face does something his control didn't sanction. "I was thinking about fish," he said. She looked at him. "The spring feeds the stream. The stream runs north for several miles before it joins the main river. If there are fish in the river," he gestured at the water, "there may be fish here, a secondary food source that doesn't require hunting range." He paused. "I don't know how to fish. I've never had reason to learn. I find it," another pause, "irritating." The thing she felt then was not something she'd catalogued before. It was warm and specific, and had something to do with the image of Lucien Aquintaine, former prince, feared strategist, man who reduced soldiers to silence with a look, being irritated by his own ignorance of fish. "I know how to fish," she said. "Of course you do," he said, dry. The tone he used when he was amused and didn't intend to be. She sat down on the granite shelf and he sat beside her, close, their shoulders almost touching, and she explained fishing in northern streams in the early spring, with the same practical sequence she'd used for the fields, and he listened with the complete attention he gave to things that mattered, asking questions that were intelligent and specific. And around them the morning continued its slow arrival, and the water came out of the rock, cold and constant, and entirely indifferent to what was beginning in the people beside it. His hand was on the granite between them, a few inches from hers. She was aware of it the way she was aware of all of him lately, constantly, at a low register, like a sound just below what demands direct attention, but shapes the texture of everything above it. She finished explaining. Silence settled. The stream moved. He turned and looked at her with the full weight of the gray eyes that had been studying her for weeks, adding everything she'd shown him. The fields, the spring, the mornings here, the precise movements of her hands on the mattock handle, the way she managed his mother and his people, and the difficult logistics of impossible circumstances. Adding it all together and arriving, visibly, at something. "Layla," he said, just her name. But the way he said it, with a specificity, like a word he had chosen from a long list of available words and found to be the most accurate, made her understand it was not a greeting or a preamble. "Yes," she said, before he'd asked anything. He looked at her for another moment with that look that was taking inventory of her. Then he kissed her in the cold early morning by the spring with the same quality of certainty he brought to everything he decided, not tentative, not performative, just real and present and his and hers. That night he came to her differently than he had on the road. Before, it had been need stripped of pretense, 2 people in the dark choosing something physical, because the physical was honest when everything else was uncertain. She did not regret it. It had been what it was, and she did not reduce things by regretting them. This was different. He took his time. That was the first difference. The man who was precise and economical with everything gave her time that had no logistical justification, and she understood it for what it was. He learned her like he was reading something he intended to know completely, his hands moving with the same systematic attention as his eyes when he entered a room. Thorough, unhurried, finding what was there rather than assuming it. When he stripped the rough wool of her dress away, the bite of the cold air was immediate, but the heat of his body was a counter-argument she couldn't ignore. He didn't rush. He moved his mouth over her skin with a deliberate, agonizing slowness, documenting the curve of her hip, the hollow of her throat, the way her breath hitched when his teeth grazed the sensitive skin of her inner thigh. When she pulled him closer, his skin slick with sweat and the scent of wood smoke, he made a low sound against her throat that was not controlled, not strategic, entirely involuntary, a raw, animal admission of need that she felt in her very marrow. The friction of the coarse palate beneath them was a reminder of the grit of their lives. But the weight of him was the only thing that felt solid. She said his name once, quietly, and felt him still for a moment the way something stills when it hears its own sound in a context it hasn't before. Then he moved, a sharp, driving urgency taking over, and the stillness broke open into something visceral that she felt for a long time afterward. Later, Much later, the camp entirely silent, the cold outside the shelter pressed against the canvas like something patient. He lay with his arm across her waist and said, "You're thinking." "I'm always thinking," she said. "What about?" She considered lying, and discarded it for the same reason she always discarded it with him. "That this is temporary," she said. "Everything I've had has been temporary." His arm didn't move. He didn't offer her reassurance, which she would have rejected. He was quiet in the way of a person giving something serious the weight it deserved. "Yes," he said finally. "Everything is." She turned her head. He was looking at the canvas above them with the forward, calculating attention that was simply his face at rest. "But some temporary things," he said carefully, "last longer than others." He paused. "And some things you build properly hold." She thought about the fields, about the channels from the spring, about the bed frames that gave the seedlings 2 extra degrees, and the work that was in the ground now, invisible, holding potential. She didn't say anything. He didn't need her to. She lay in the dark and felt the warmth of him along the length of her, and listened to the settlement outside breathing in its sleep. The 39 people who had been left at the edge of the world and were, improbably, and with enormous difficulty, and something that was beginning to look like determination, choosing to remain. The first green shoots appeared on a Thursday. She saw them in the early morning, alone at the field, and crouched in the cold to look at them, small, definitive, the specific color of something that has decided to be alive despite the conditions. She stayed crouched for a while without doing anything. Just looked at them. She thought about 2,150, about the recycled air and the gray compound walls and the world that had been ending slowly for so long that the ending had become ordinary. She thought about the novel she'd been reading in the last days of everything, about the fantasy kingdom with its perfect heroine and its dramatic throne battles, and how she had landed in the margins of it. In the part the author hadn't bothered to name, she put her hand flat on the cold ground beside the chutes. The earth was solid under her palm, present, real. She had been surviving for so long that she had forgotten there was something on the other side of surviving. She was beginning, carefully and without rushing it, to remember. Behind her, from the direction of the camp, she heard a horse, Lucien, heading out early, the rhythm of it now as recognizable to her as weather. She heard him stop. She didn't turn around. She heard the horse shift its weight and the small sounds of a man sitting still on a horse looking at something. Then the hooves moved again, slowly, north into the trees. She took her hand off the ground and stood and went back to work. Spring arrived in the coldlands the way difficult things often do. Not all at once, not with announcement, but in accumulation. A day that was cold but less cold than the day before. A morning where the light came earlier by a margin too small to measure but somehow felt. The stream running louder as the snowmelt from the ridge began its slow contribution. Small signals, easy to miss if you were watching for the dramatic version, which the coldlands were not interested in providing. Layla noticed all of them. She had been noticing things since 2150. Since before that, since the particular variety of childhood that teaches you early that the gap between sufficient and insufficient is often measured in details other people overlook. But she noticed the spring's arrival differently than she noticed most things. Not as data exactly, though it was data. Not as resource assessment exactly, though she was doing that too. She noticed it the way you notice something you had not known you were waiting for until it began to arrive. 6 weeks since the border. 41 days by the marks on her belt, which was now soft with wear, and smelled of the iron-dark soil of the northern fields. The settlement had a name. She hadn't known who had named it first. These things spread through communities the way fire spreads through dry grass, and by the time you notice it, the origin is already behind you. Someone had started calling it Ashhold, and then everyone was calling it Ashhold, and now it was on the rough map Lucien kept updated on a piece of bark in their shelter, and Foss the builder had scratched it onto the post at the camp's entrance with a chisel he'd shaped from a piece of salvaged iron, and that was that. It was a place. It had a name. It had, by the 41st day, the following: 14 structures in various stages of completion, ranging from the solid log shelter that Orvin had essentially built with his own hands, and then replicated for 3 other families, to the more provisional arrangements of people still working out what permanence meant in a place they hadn't chosen. A fire circle at the settlement center that had been burning continuously for 3 weeks, maintained in rotation, which had become the thing communities discover they need before they understand why. A hearth that belongs to everyone, a center of gravity. The irrigation channels from the spring, finished on the 32nd day, running in 2 clean lines to the lower field, which Layla surveyed each morning with a pride she kept carefully private. The fields themselves, 3 of them now, the original site, a second one they'd broken in the 2nd week, and a narrow strip along the stream bank that Lucien had identified while following the water upstream one morning, and had come back to tell her about with the same tone he used for tactical intelligence, which was how she understood he was offering her something. All 3 were planted. The first had been showing green for 10 days. The other two were still waiting, the ground still holding its secrets, but she knew what was in there. She had put it there with her own hands and the hands of 9 other people. And she knew. They would eat. Maybe not abundantly, not yet, but they would eat from this ground before winter. And the fact of that was so significant that she had not yet allowed herself to feel the full weight of it, because she needed to continue functioning, and the full weight of it was not a small thing. Lucien had become, without ceremony or mandate, the settlement's authority. She watched this happen over 6 weeks with the same careful attention she'd given everything else here, and what she observed was not the assumption of power. She'd seen that in the novel, in the court scenes, the calculated maneuvering for position. What she watched was something quieter and more interesting. A man discovering that the thing he had been fighting for was not the thing he had actually wanted. He had wanted to govern Elthidria because he was better at governing than Edward, and he knew it. And the injustice of capacity being overridden by birth had been a wound that Mara, with her brilliant and relentless ambition for him, had kept carefully open. He had wanted the throne because he'd been told he deserved it, and because the alternative, accepting that merit was not the deciding factor in the world's organization, was intolerable to a man built the way he was built. But Elthidria had not wanted managing. It had wanted performing. The court was a theater, and what it required of its king was the performance of kingship. The rituals, the alliances, the endless management of perception and precedent. Lucien had no patience for theater. He had patience for problems. Real ones, with real solutions, where the feedback was immediate and material and not subject to the interpretations of people whose primary interest was their own position. Ashhold was a problem, continuously, exhaustingly, specifically a problem, every day presenting new versions of itself that required attention and decision, and the willingness to be wrong and correct the course without collapsing around the admission. He met each version of it with the focused engagement of a man finally operating in his own correct medium. She watched him and thought, this is what he was for. Not despite the exile. Because of it. He was not gentle in his leadership. She had not expected gentle. He was precise and demanding and occasionally frightening in the way that very capable people are frightening when they are fully engaged. The sense of something operating at a level that leaves no room for inadequacy. He had no interest in telling people what they wanted to hear. He had significant interest in what was actually true, and what actually needed doing, and who was actually capable of doing it. But he was fair. Consistently, inflexibly fair. Which she had come to understand was the quality that mattered most to people who had been dealt with unfairly. Not kindness exactly, not warmth, but the reliable application of consistent standards. Corwick, who had been the source of arguments in the first 2 weeks, was now one of Lucien's most reliable people, assigned to the hunting rotation, and conducting himself with the purpose of a man who has been given a framework he can function inside. Fosse the builder had produced 3 structures better than his initial estimate. Hesta had essentially become the settlement's economist, managing resources with a precision that made Layla think of central planning modules from her resource management coursework, transposed into a medieval clearing. Even her father had found his place, a thing she had thought unlikely, and had been instructed by events to reconsider. He was, it turned out, a natural fisherman. This discovery had occurred on the 12th day when Layla had taken a small group to the stream to begin testing the technique she'd described to Lucien at the spring, and her father had watched for 20 minutes and then simply waded in with the particular confidence of someone who doesn't know enough to be afraid of failure, and caught 4 fish in an hour by a method that was mostly instinct and partially insane and entirely effective. He had looked up from the water with the expression of a man discovering something he was good at for the first time at 53, and she had felt something loosen in her chest that she didn't investigate too closely. He fished every day now. He was teaching 2 of the children. He was, in his impractical and belatedly discovered way, contributing, and the contribution had changed something in him that she observed without requiring it to be more than it was. Mara watched all of it. Layla had not underestimated Mara from the beginning, and did not make the error now of thinking that a woman who had stepped back meant a woman who had stepped away. Mara occupied the settlement's edges with the patient precision of someone who understood that the moment for direct action had passed, and what was required now was something more sustainable. She cooked, exceptionally as it turned out, deploying the settlement's limited supplies with a creativity that Layla recognized as applied intelligence wearing domestic clothing. She maintained her own shelter with a self-sufficiency that required nothing from anyone. She offered opinions when asked and occasionally when not asked, and her opinions were worth hearing, which meant they got heard. She and Layla had reached, over 6 weeks, an arrangement that was not quite friendship and not quite alliance, but contained elements of both. It was built on the mutual recognition of the kind of people they each were, practical, observant, not interested in performance, and on the unspoken understanding that they both wanted the same thing, which was Lucien's continued existence and eventual flourishing, and that this shared want was large enough to build a working relationship on. Mara came to the lower field one morning while Layla was assessing the second planting. She stood at the field's edge for a moment and looked at the green beginning of the first crop with an expression Layla caught from the corner of her eye. Something private and considerable, quickly reorganized. He sleeps, Mara said, like a man who has stopped fighting his own mind. Layla continued her assessment. Is that unusual? You have no idea. She paused. He did not sleep. For years, not properly. I used to hear him walking at night, in the palace. 3-4 in the morning. He thought I didn't know. Layla straightened, looked at the field. He walked because he couldn't stop calculating, Mara said. The throne, the positioning, the next move. His mind would not stop. A pause. Here it stops. Here there's enough to think about that the mind gets tired, Layla said. Yes, Mara said. That's part of it. She turned to look at Layla directly, with the sharp, undecorated gaze that saw more than most things did. You are the other part. Layla said nothing. I knew when I saw you in that corridor, Mara said. Not the bread before the bread. The way you moved through that prison. Most people keep their eyes down in places like that. You were watching everything. Costing it. A small pause. It takes one to know one. Layla looked at her. What do you want me to say to that? Nothing, Mara said, with something in her voice that was the closest she came to warmth. I just wanted you to know that I saw it. She turned back to the field. The second planting will come up within the week if this weather holds. Yes, Layla said. Good, Mara said, and walked back toward the settlement. She found Lucien at the map that evening. He had graduated from the bark, rendering to something more permanent, a piece of treated hide that Orvin had prepared, with the settlement's layout drawn in careful detail and the surrounding territory marked in expanding notes. He sat outside their shelter in the last of the light, with the map across his knees and a piece of charcoal, adding to it, updating the hunting territory to the northeast where he'd ranged that morning. She sat beside him and looked at what he'd built over 6 weeks. The map was, in its way, a portrait of how his mind worked. Comprehensive, detailed, nothing approximate that could be made precise. The annotations in small, controlled script that she'd come to recognize as his version of speech when speech was insufficient. 3 deer today, he said. North of the second ridge. The grazing is better up there. Less competition from the settlement's footprint. How's the east route? Thinner than I'd like. I'm going to rest it for a week, let the territory recover. He looked at the map. We need a second hunter, someone who can take the east while I range north. DAV, she said immediately. He looked up. The corporal. He came back. She'd noticed him 2 days ago, the young soldier who had carried messages between the escort and the exiles, appearing at the settlement's edge with his horse and a look of enormous uncertainty, the expression of a man who has made a decision he hasn't yet fully caught up with. Lucien had spoken to him briefly, and she hadn't heard the conversation, but DAV had been given a place to sleep and had been present at meals since, helping with whatever needed doing with the eager usefulness of someone proving a case. He was a guard, Lucien said, not objection. Assessment. He knows how to track. I watched him on the road. He moved differently than the others in the forest sections, noticing things. She paused. He came back because Harwick reported to the capital, and the response was that the assignment was complete and the escort was dissolved. He had nowhere to go back to. He came here because this was the last place he felt useful. Lucien looked at her with the expression she'd stopped being able to encounter without a particular physical response in her chest. The expression of a man who has been given information he values from a source he trusts, and is experiencing both of these things simultaneously. When did you know all that? He said. DAV mentioned Harwick's report to Hesta at breakfast. Hesta told me about the dissolution. The rest is observation. She paused. You'd have gotten there, probably tonight, he said. Dry. You saved me an evening. She felt the thing she felt increasingly in his company, a warmth so specific and located that she could not convincingly classify it as anything other than what it was. She had been trying to classify it as something else for 6 weeks. She was running out of alternative categories. He was looking at the map again, but the quality of his attention had split. Some of it on the hide in his hands, and some of it somewhere else, turned inward in the way he turned inward when he was approaching something he hadn't yet decided how to say. She waited. She was good at waiting. She had waited out worse things than Lucien Aquintaine, deciding how to say something. I've been thinking, he said. I know, she said, about the settlement. A pause. About next winter, we need more structures before the cold returns. Permanent ones, properly built. Orvin can lead the construction if we give him the right materials, which means a salvage run to the tree line north of the second ridge where there's the old. I found the remains of something up there, previous settlement maybe. There's worked timber in it that can be. Lucien, she said. He stopped. You're not thinking about timber, she said. A long pause. The last light was going, the sky above the ridge moving through its evening colors. The cold lands had extraordinary skies, she had discovered, the absence of the capital's smoke allowing a clarity that felt almost aggressive in its beauty. No, he said. She looked at the sky. I lost something, he said, that I had spent my entire life believing was the measure of me. He said it with the careful precision of someone who has turned a thing over many times in the dark before bringing it into the light. And I have been waiting to feel the loss of it the way I expected to feel it. He paused. I don't. She was quiet. What I feel instead, he said, is, he stopped, made a small, frustrated sound that was almost a laugh, the sound of a man whose vocabulary is failing him at an inconvenient moment. I don't have a word for it. Describe it, she said. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the map, at the settlement, at the fire circle, where 3 people sat, and one of the children was laughing at something. Like a man who spent 20 years in a room that didn't fit him, he said slowly, and has walked out and found the right room, and cannot fully believe the dimensions are correct. She felt the weight of this settle around her. The cold lands. The hard ground. The fields, with their green beginning. 39 people, building lives from the edge of nothing. A man who had tried to take a throne discovering at 30 that he'd been trying to take the wrong thing all along. Yes, she said quietly. I know that feeling. He turned to look at her. She met his eyes in the dying light and let him see, for once, without the management, without the careful calibration of what she showed and what she held back, let him see the actual account. The girl from 2150, in a body that wasn't hers, in a world she'd read about in the last days of everything, in a settlement at the edge of a map with her hands in the cold soil and herb seedlings on a window ledge that no longer existed, and a man beside her who had gone from being the villain of a story to being the most real thing in it. He looked at her for a long time, then he put the map down and reached out and took her hand from her lap. Not the urgent reaching of the road, not the certain claiming of the weeks before, but something slower and more deliberate. He turned her hand over and looked at it. The calluses from the mattock, the dirt still worked into the grain of the knuckles despite washing, the crescent scar at the base of the thumb that she'd inherited with the body and made hers. He pressed his mouth to the center of her palm. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was quiet and specific, and so entirely intentional that she felt it in every part of herself. The warmth of his lips against the callous skin of her working hand, the knowledge that he had looked at this hand. This evidence of everything she had done in this place, everything she had chosen to build, and had decided it was what he wanted his mouth on. She closed her fingers around his jaw and felt the roughness of several days and looked at him in the near dark and thought, there it is. There it was. That night was different from all the other nights. He laid her down in their shelter, with a reverence that contradicted everything the word dangerous was supposed to mean when applied to him. Not differently careful. She knew the difference between care taken and care given, and this was the latter, freely, unhurried. He moved over her in the dark like a man who had nowhere else to be, and had decided this was the fact he intended to inhabit completely. She had never been made love to before. She understood the distinction now. She had been wanted before, had been reached for, had participated in exchanges that were honest in their way, mutual, reasonable, appropriate to what they were. This was not an exchange. This was something offered without ledger, without the implicit structure of equivalent return. He moved with a grit and intensity that matched the world they were building. His mouth was everywhere, mapping the scars and strength of her body, his hands rough but sure. When he entered her, it wasn't the frantic desperation of the road, but a deep, driving possession. She met his rhythm, her own hands digging into the muscles of his back, the scent of wood smoke and clean sweat filling the small space. Every touch was a claim, every breath a promise spoken in the language of the body. They were 2 broken things, finding a way to fit together, creating a heat that defied the frost creeping over the northern border. He said her name once, against her temple, and the way he said it, like it meant something precise, like it was the exact right word, undid her more thoroughly than anything physical had managed. She held on to him in the dark and let herself be undone, and when it was over she lay with her face against his throat and breathed, and felt his hand moving slowly through her hair and thought, this is the thing I was afraid of. Not this specific thing. This exact specific thing. His hand in her hair, the darkness, the warmth, the feeling in her chest that had no tactical justification and no survival function, and was therefore more frightening than anything she had managed since waking up in this body on this cold stone floor. You're thinking, he said. His voice was low and unhurried. I'm always thinking. What about? His hand continued its movement, steady, patient. He was not going to let her not answer. That I don't know how to do this, she said. What? She was quiet for a moment. Stay. His hand stilled. I know how to survive, she said. I know how to assess and adapt and manage and produce. I know how to be useful. I don't, she paused. I have not been good at being somewhere. At letting somewhere be real. He was quiet for long enough that she started to wonder if she'd miscalculated, if the honesty was more than the situation could hold. Layla, he said. Yes. Look at the field tomorrow morning. She waited. Tell me that's not real, he said. Tell me what you put in that ground isn't real. She thought about the shoots, the small green certainty of them in the cold morning. I can't, she said. No, he said. You can't. His hand resumed its movement. You've been building something real since the day I woke up in that cart and found you there. You don't get to decide it's temporary after the fact. She heard something in it. Not demand, not reassurance, something more honest than either. An argument from evidence. The kind of case she couldn't refute, because she had personally laid every piece of evidence. She didn't say anything. She put her hand over his where it rested against her hair, and they lay in the dark, and the cold lands continued their indifferent business outside, and the settlement breathed around them. She woke before him in the early gray and went to the fields. The second planting was up, not the handful of shoots the first had started with. She had been more precise with the bed preparation this time, the soil composition better calibrated, the drainage more exact, the companion planting arranged correctly. And what had come up was a full carpet of early green, dense and definitive, the ground's answer to the question she had put to it 3 weeks ago. She stood at the field's edge and looked at it. Behind her she heard footsteps she recognized and did not turn around. He stopped beside her and looked at what she was looking at. The morning was pale and cold with a thin fog off the stream, the kind of fog that burns off by mid-morning and leaves the air sharp and clean. Mara will make something insufferable, he said, of this being a metaphor. Your mother is never wrong, Layla said. It's her most exhausting quality. She heard what she'd done, repeated his own words back to him, at the same moment he did. She felt him look at her. She kept her eyes on the field, and felt the warmth moving up through her chest that was not the sun, which had not yet appeared, but was instead the thing she had been naming and not naming for 6 weeks. We need more beds, she said, before the end of the week if the weather holds. Tell me what you need, he said. More hands. Foss's people, if you can spare them from the shelter construction. 2 days. I'll have them after the east wall is finished. She nodded. The fog was thinning at the field's edges where the morning air moved through. In the settlement behind them she could hear the first sounds of the day beginning. Fire being stoked, water being drawn, the particular morning sounds of a place that has learned its own rhythms. She thought about 2150, about the filtered air and the recycled light and the gray compound walls and the world running out of the materials required to continue. She thought about reading a novel in the last days of it, a romance in a fantasy kingdom, an escapism so ordinary and so human that she had not known it was also a door until she was already through it. She had not chosen this world. She had not chosen this body, this name, this cold ground, this improbable settlement, this man standing beside her in the morning fog, looking at the evidence of what she had built. But she had chosen, small choice by small choice, mattock stroke by mattock stroke, morning by morning, what this place was becoming. What she was becoming in it. The first bread made from the settlement's own grain would be 7 weeks away, maybe 8. She had the timeline mapped precisely, the growth stages, the harvest estimate, the milling arrangement she was already in conversation with Orvin about, because his hands could work iron into what she needed. She knew exactly what was coming and what it would require, and she had the clear-eyed, practiced assessment of a woman who had been managing survival for long enough to know the difference between a plan that would hold and one that wouldn't. This one would hold. She reached out without looking at him and found his hand, and held it in the cold morning air, and looked at the green field and felt. Carefully, without rushing it, with the specific caution of someone approaching something precious. The particular weight of a life that was becoming, against all probability, worth being in. His hand closed around hers. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He was a man who showed things through what he did rather than what he said, and what he did was hold her hand in the cold morning and look at the field she had made from difficult ground and stay. They stood there until the fog burned off and the settlement woke around them and the day made its demands, which were many and hard and entirely, finally theirs. The end. Thanks for following along with the survival of Ashhold. If you're enjoying Layla and Lucien's journey in the Coldlands, don't forget to like this video, drop a comment with your favorite moment, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a chapter. See you in the next one.